Chapter 2. Decoding the Male Psyche. Carl Gustav Jung founded the school of analytical or depth psychology that provides the overall framework for our work. We rely heavily also on insights from theorists of other schools, such as Sigmund Freud, Erik Erikson, D.W. Winnicott, Heinz Kohut, and Alice Miller. But we believe Jung's approach is the only one to provide a truly transcultural understanding of our human psyche. His is also the only approach to adequately bridge the gap between modern science and the mythological and spiritual traditions of our species. Jungian depth psychology values the mysteries of the human soul. Dreams, visions, symbols, images, and cultural achievements arise from those mysterious depths that the world's religions understand as the spiritual dimension. Depth psychology embraces all human experience as authentic to the psyche. Consequently, phenomena such as the soul, demonic possession, revelation, prayer, or God are completely compatible with scientific truth. Because all experiences are psychological, all are real, no matter how strange. Above all, any human experience is both based on and perceived by the deep psychological structures within us. Before we explore the deep structures of the male psyche, it will be helpful to define a few Jungian terms. Myth. For depth psychologists, myth does not imply a naive, untrue, pre-scientific tale about the origins of the world or humankind. Myths are true stories that describe the ways of the psyche and the means by which our psychological energies interact. Myths project our inner dynamics onto the outer world and allow us to experience it through the filter of how we think and feel. Since, in a real sense, we are the universe and the universe is us, myths often accurately describe the workings of the larger universe by using anthropomorphic images. That is to say, we are products of the universe in the same way that galaxies, oceans, and trees are. It would be a very strange thing indeed if our psyche did not mirror the structures found outside in the cosmos. An immediate and intimate correspondence between inner and outer is fundamental to our nature as beings. If no such link existed, we would be unable to acquire any realistic or workable knowledge of the world. We would be unable to survive. Ultimately, it is possible that inner and outer are purely subjective, pragmatic distinctions made by our consciousness in order to navigate within a mystery it cannot fully fathom. Creation myths illustrate this beautifully. In the Bible, the Hebrew God Yahweh creates the material world by speaking. He says, "Let there be such and there is such and such." Behind this concept of creation stands the idea that naming something brings it into existence. Of course, modern science maintains the world did not come into being through a divine uttering of words or the naming of material objects. The biblical account does not convey a scientific truth about the world's origin. The truth it speaks is psychological. Human consciousness at its height is developed largely by the mastering of words. Arising from language, at the same time it gives rise to language. Consciousness creates our experience as it defines creation. The words we use for things allow us to distinguish this from that. They also profoundly color how we think and feel about those things. What we cannot name is therefore not fully real or fully experienced for us. As far as our psyche is concerned, an unnamed thing is uncreated. Thus, the biblical image of Yahweh creating the world by naming it is true to human psychological processes. At the same time, if we assume there is an intelligence behind the created world, it might be true that that intelligence manifested the universe through some process analogous to the human use of language. If this were so, the biblical story would be working both as a psychological parable and as a visionary expression of a process that really is occurring. Ego. When Jungian psychoanalysts talk about the ego, they usually mean the I we normally think of as ourselves. The ego is who we believe ourselves to be, the part of our psyche we identify with our name. When we say, I feel this way about something, or I think I'll do that, the ego is probably speaking. Jungian theorists sometimes define the ego as a complex. By this, they mean a structural element of the total psyche that exhibits certain specific features. The ego operates in what we imagine to be our capacity to think rationally, in our feelings, in our ability to will actions, remember the past, and create the future, and in our encounter with consciousness. In reality, however, the question of the ego is more complicated. Often, I am not the one who is thinking, feeling, acting, willing, or deciding. Rather, some autonomous complex other than the ego may temporarily possess it and make it operate out of the complex's perspective. Since the ego is largely unaware of these other complexes, it is tricked into the illusory feeling of holding a solitary place in the psyche, and into an accompanying illusion of its free will. According to Jung, the other complexes operate largely from the personal unconscious, but may also be anchored in a transpersonal unconscious, which exerts a deeper influence on the psyche. Consciousness. Consciousness is not confined to the ego. The subconscious, or unconscious, is itself conscious. It is only unconscious, invisible, and indistinct from the ego's perspective. Personal complexes other than the ego, and the deeper transpersonal psychological structures of the unconscious, can be conscious of each other and of the ego, and they operate out of their own agendas. The case of multiple personality disorder demonstrates this clearly. Here, highly activated complexes usurp the place of the ego in the daily affairs of the afflicted person, causing him or her to behave in ways the ego neither wishes nor sometimes even remembers afterward. What is true for people who suffer multiple personality disorder is true, though to a lesser extent, for all of us. We all at times act in ways contrary to how our ego wills us to behave, perhaps through deep mood swings and emotionally violent outbursts of fear and rage. When we return to a state of ego consciousness, we say such things as, I went out of my head, or I don't know what came over me. What came over us, like a wave of energy that shifted our whole mode of perceiving, feeling, and acting, was an autonomous complex. Another consciousness from within the total psychic system that is our self. Autonomous complexes are usually, though not always, organized around traumatic childhood experiences. During early traumas, our emerging egos split off and repressed aspects of the psyche that parents, siblings, or society found unacceptable. These split-off aspects could be thoughts, feelings, images, or associations. Often they are valuable and worth recall. They may carry hidden talents, intuitions, abilities, or accurate feelings that would make our personalities wiser and more complete if we could reintegrate them. Until reintegration can occur, our psyches are like the pieces of a broken mirror, which hold in fragments what was once a complete reflection. through all our complexes, including the ego, and the vast territory of the unconscious. Consciousness pervades our psyche. Archetypes. Archetypes operate at a level of the psyche deeper than that of the personal unconscious with its autonomous complexes. They are the hardwired components of our genetically transmitted psychic machine. They are the bedrock structures that define the human psyche's own nature, and make it the same regardless of the culture in which an individual lives. In this sense, archetypes represent transpersonal human psychological characteristics. They are dynamic, energic elements in all of us. They well up and fall deep within our unconscious, like tidal pools. Our daily life is influenced by these energies in ways we can never fully understand. Jung declared that the archetypes are equivalent to the instincts of other animals. He located them in what he called the collective unconscious. The existence of an unconscious, or what many called the subconscious, have been noted for some time. But Freud was the first to make it the focus of major psychological investigation. Before him, even where psychologists acknowledge the subconscious mind's existence, they usually dismissed it as an inert repository of forgotten or repressed experiences. Freud's interest in the mind's possibilities had been aroused during his medical studies with the great Parisian hypnotist Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot dismissed the results of his own experimental demonstrations as stemming from patient hysteria. Whatever their source, the hypnotic manifestations witnessed by the young Freud convinced him he'd found a rich field for further study. Common to all of us, Freud's life work implied was a subconscious deeper than a particular personal one. He called this instinctually based subconscious the id, the Latin word for it. This wild, primitive id was responsible for all kinds of enormously powerful and irrational impulses, especially aggressive sexuality. Classic Freudians have tended to regard the subconscious as more or less unstructured, but a number of Neo-Freudians maintain that the deep psyche, far from being chaotic, is characterized by structure. Erik Erikson talks about instinctive structures and preformed action patterns, which under appropriate circumstances call up drive energy for instantaneous, vigorous, and skillful release. He proposes the existence of a general psychic energy, instinctual force, which can be put to use by a variety of preformed and relatively autonomous instinctive patterns. He also says, the action patterns, the modes and modalities are all present in the ground plan from the beginning, yet they have their special time of ascending. His thoughts come remarkably close to the Jungian conception of time and circumstance released archetypal action patterns from the collective unconscious. Jung pushed the exploration of the collective unconscious structures a step further. Stored within them, he claimed, are both the human psyche's archetypal building blocks and the accumulated collective memory of the entire human race. He reached this conclusion because he discovered that symbols, images, myths, and gods from different cultures and epochs bore striking resemblances to one another and also to the images that appeared in his patient's dreams. According to his conception, the collective unconscious is the source and the limitless reservoir of all the images recorded in human art, mythology, and religion. From it leap both the poet's song and the scientist's insight. From it flow the signal dreams which have implication often for an entire society as much as for their dreamer. The psyche's archetypal structures serve as conduits for great charges of primal psychological energy. Because of their own dynamic configuration, they mold this energy, imparting to it their particular patterns. Psychologists call this life force in psychic form the libido. Freud believed it is fundamentally sexual. Any expression of the libido redirected into pursuits other than sexual ones he called sublimations. Jung, on the other hand, believed that the libido is a generalized life force that expresses itself through imaginal and spiritual impulses as well as through sexuality. For any individual, the archetypes may be creative and life-enhancing or destructive and death-dealing. The result depends in part on how the ego is able to relate to them based on its own developmental history. Properly accessing and using the libido available to the psyche amount to a sort of psychological technology. If we learn the technology and use it properly, we can use the energy to make generative men and women of ourselves. But if we fail to learn how to use these vast energy resources or misuse them, we will be courting our own destruction, and we may take others with us. If we try to ignore the archetypes, they exert their mighty influence upon us nonetheless. They bend us to their non-human, sometimes inhuman, wills. We must therefore face the evidence depth psychology and other studies have provided us. We are not as free of instinct or unconscious content as we have been encouraged to believe. Genuine freedom for the ego results from acknowledging and properly accessing the chemical fires that burn hot in our unconscious minds. Some Jungian analysts romanticize the archetypes. They encourage their patients to find and claim the particular archetype or myth that has organized their lives. Life then becomes a process of affirming and living out this myth. In our opinion, our goal should not be to identify with an archetypal pattern, or to allow a mythic expression of it to make our lives what it will. We believe that when we romantically identify with any archetype, we cease to be viable human beings moving toward wholeness. If we are drawn to an archetype by its seductive power, its promise that we can shirk our individual responsibilities and the pain involved in being a person with a personal ego, we will be crushed by the sheer weight of unconscious compulsive impulses. On the other hand, our goal is not to become ordinary in our quest for psychic health. We must not lose the vital connection with the libidinal energy the archetypes supply us so that we can live our lives fully, energetically, and creatively. Our goal is to learn how to differentiate ourselves from the archetypes without completely disassociating ourselves from them. If we learn to access them successfully, they become resources of energy both for our personal lives and for healing our planet. We become more radiant in every area of our lives. More precisely stated, our objective is to develop mature ego structures, strong enough to channel useful libidinal energy into our daily lives. We can begin by making ourselves conscious of how archetypal energies already possess us. Only then can we begin to access them creatively through a process that provides us with a greater sense of free will in the choices of our lives. The effort to achieve liberation for ourselves will in turn motivate us to help others to do the same. Our renewed energies benefit ourselves and others on all the levels of our psychic organization: the personal, the familial, the communal, national, and global. Shadow Jung himself occasionally identified the shadow with the totality of the unconscious. But most depth psychologists view the shadow as an individual, multifaceted contra-ego of the same sex as the ego. If the ego is a photograph, the shadow is its negative. Standing in direct opposition to the ego, the shadow is an autonomous complex which holds opinions, expresses feelings, and generally wills an agenda radically different from the ego's. Like most autonomous complexes, the shadow results from childhood trauma. Those qualities of a person's total psyche that are diametrically opposed to the emerging ego and which the ego rejects because of the pressures of the childhood environment coalesce in the unconscious. There, they form a distinct conscious, willing entity. Unless reintegrated later in life, they forever seek to sabotage the ego's plans and behaviors. We have all had the experience of willing one scenario and living quite another. For example, we intend to remain friendly while visiting our in-laws, but then we find ourselves drawn irresistibly into arguments and confrontation. Our egos want to maintain an image of family harmony. Our shadows, unable to tolerate such hypocrisy and feeling real animosity toward our in-laws, compel us to behave in a more honest, if more destructive way. The animosity we feel is ultimately toward ourselves, but it often takes a lot of work before we can realize this. The shadow endorses this work because it longs for reintegration. It is the shadow's method to lead us into holding our impossibly defensive, illogical positions in order to confront us with whatever psychic complexes we would rather forget. Our real-world hatreds are most usually against these inner complexes, and our shadow works by repetition compulsion to call our attention to them. Rather than face any rejected qualities, either positive or negative, within ourselves, we frequently deal with our shadow by projecting those qualities onto others. As an ego, we don't project them, but our shadow does, so in order to focus our interest on its feelings, wishes, and agendas. Our shadow induces us to see other people we disapprove of or dislike in colors that are perhaps only marginally like their true colors, but which are colors that the shadow itself possesses. Jung believed withdrawing a projection of the shadow and owning it as a part of ourselves requires enormous moral courage. He also believed that what we will not face within our psyche, we will be forced to confront in the outer world. So, if we can claim our shadow's qualities and learn from them, we defuse much of the interpersonal conflict we would otherwise encounter. People who have served as the screens for our shadow's projections become less odious and more human. At the same time, we experience ourselves as richer, more complex, and more powerful individuals. The triangular structure of the archetypes. In this book, our definition of the shadow includes this traditional Jungian understanding, but introduces another archetypal transpersonal aspect to it as well. We believe masculine and feminine archetypes possess their own shadows. The king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover are the masculine archetypal structures we have undertaken to study in this series. In one sense, these archetypes are operating at more primitive levels than the ego accessing them, and each has its own shadow. In our extended definition, a shadow always manifests where there is an immature, fragmentary psyche, because splitting is always a symptom of unintegrated development. In the traditional Jungian view of maturity, wholeness is achieved to the degree that the split between the ego and the shadow is overcome. In other words, psychological maturity is a measure of how thoroughly the ego is able to integrate the shadow into its consciousness. We maintain that the ego-shadow split represents a shadow system in itself. The split actually involves the ego in the bipolar shadow of one or more archetypes. In this situation, our ego usually identifies with one pole of the archetypal shadow and disassociates from the other. In our view, then, the shadow can still be regarded in the traditional way as the psychic area from which the ego is divided, but more fully as a bipolar system characterized by splitting, repression, and projection within the energy field of an archetype. For a long time, psychologists associated bipolar disorder almost exclusively with the manic-depressive personality. Then, in his modern psychopathology, Theodore Milan extended the idea of bipolarity to include passive and active dimensions in all the major disorders of personality. In a similar fashion, some Jungians have described a bipolar relationship between certain archetypes, though they are not in themselves personality disorders. That gave rise to such archetypal pairs as the Senex Puer, Old Man, Eternal Boy, the Domina Puella, Old Woman, Eternal Girl, and others. In the case of the warrior archetype, for example, neither the sadist nor the masochist, the two poles of the warrior shadow, represents personal growth or fulfillment. The full embodiment of the warrior is to be found in a third transcending option that integrates the two poles into a creative psychological structure. Since they define psychic wholeness, archetypes always reconcile opposing forces in this way. Both of the opposing poles in the archetypal shadow systems contain qualities essential for psychological health. But if left in their state of chronic tension, they will condemn the ego to a fragmented and immature existence. Guided by the archetypes in their transcending fullness, a mature personality integrates these important qualities by reconciling the divisions in the archetypal shadow. Our refined understanding of how the archetypes work suggests interesting analogies with other schools of thought. The psychologist Alfred Adler, a contemporary of Freud and Jung, believed personality disorders appear both in active and passive modes, in a way similar to our view of how archetypal shadow systems work. The Christian theologian Paul Tillich grounded his thought with a belief in what he called the ambiguities of space and time in the created world. He believed that these ambiguities find their resolution in a third higher reality above history. The impulse to achieve this comes from the spirit. The German philosopher Hegel saw the forward movement of the universe as occurring through a thesis, antithesis, synthesis process, in which each synthesis became a new thesis, and so on, in a continual upward program of evolutionary complexity and integration. Alfred North Whitehead, the great 20th century American philosopher, sees the whole adventure of ideas, ideas that create the world, as a process by which God lures the created world forward in tiny increments, which he calls occasions. These occasions are like Hegel's theses, and God is the ever-changing antithesis. Whitehead calls this unceasing process creative advance. Similarly, Jung drew from his alchemical studies the idea of the conjunctio oppositorum, union of opposites, impelled by a transcendent function, the conceptual equivalent to Tillich's spirit and Whitehead's lure. Jung believed it is essential for the ego to balance opposing images, feelings, and points of view without allowing either of the opposed sides to disappear into the unconscious. Eventually, when this struggle is consciously experienced with all the suffering it demands, our psyche can follow a transcendent third possibility into greater wholeness. Jung's followers have largely neglected the ego's vital role in determining how the archetypes will shape our everyday lives. With our model of the triangular structure of the archetypes, an individual can take care to see that the archetypes will manifest in their fullest form rather than in their shadow structures. An ego that does not properly access an archetype will be possessed by that archetype's shadow and left oscillating between the shadow's two poles. At one, the ego will suffer positive inflation, explosion, and at the other, negative inflation, implosion. Separated, the shadow's two poles express a pathological darkness which is only enlightened by polar integration into the transcendent third of the archetype. Their pathology is transformed by the ego into a creative advance. The action of the ego is the key to this transformative experience. The ego and the elements of the archetype exercise a kind of gravitational pull on each other. To allow transformation, the ego must position itself above time and space, in the domain of the spirit, or the collective unconscious. The ego will serve ultimately as an occasion for the archetype's expression in time and space. Unless the ego can work above the spatio-temporal dimension, the archetype will appear largely in its fragmented polar aspects, and the ego will attract these to itself. In the spirit's domain, the ego can instead keep its proper fix on the lodestar that the archetype's transcendent third represents. The archetype's bipolar arrangement in time and space is portrayed in the mythic image of the Symplegades, the clashing rocks the ego must pass between in pursuit of the archetype's transcendent third. The ego needs to be lured by this full expression of the archetype to experience creative advance on its own and in the world. And the archetype needs the ego in order to experience itself in space and time, and to recover its lost shadow fragments. The act of recovery empowers the archetype's ongoing creative action in the world. According to our theory, there are 4 foundational archetypes of the mature masculine, as well as of the immature masculine. Each of these triangles, king, warrior, magician, and lover, since they are interdependent aspects of the single masculine self, fit together into a pyramidal form. The pyramid, as it has appeared throughout the ages, can be interpreted as a symbol for the masculine self. Pyramids from Egypt to Mesoamerica, from Mesopotamia to Hawaii, are representations of the universe in miniature, and often display a layered or stepped form. The layers of the pyramids nearly always stand for the layers of the universe, the different cosmic levels of reality. By ascending the pyramid, an individual climbed from the profane dimension to the sacred, from the less divine to the fullest manifestation of divinity. This idea parallels ours about the upward direction of the ego's individuation from a less integrated profane state to a fully integrated, sacred or divine state. A man's ego must ascend the four faces of the step pyramid of the masculine self, thereby overcoming the bipolar shadow split at the base of each of the faces. The ego must keep its eye on the capstone of the pyramid, which represents the fullest expression in an individual life of the four archetypes in perfect unity. This ascent of ego consciousness, according to Jung, is always a matter of reconciling opposites and of integrating split psychic materials. As a man's ego ascends through each of the triangular structures of the archetypes, he becomes more integrated and whole, and he is better and better able to access the archetypes in their fullness at the top of the pyramid. On the king side, he integrates the tyrant and the weakling. On the warrior face, he integrates the sadist and the masochist. On the magician surface, he integrates the detached manipulator and the denying innocent one. And on the lover side, he integrates the addicted lover with the impotent lover. Each of the poles of the split shadows of the four major archetypes possesses insights and strengths that, when the ego integrates them, contributes to a consolidated sense of self. Each of the bipolar opposites, when united, reveals the transcendent third of the archetype in its fullness. By overcoming the splitness in the bipolar archetypal shadows, a man comes to feel inwardly empowered. And, in a sense, while he is building internal masculine structure, he is also discovering the pyramid of the masculine self, which has always been within him, at his core. The archetypes and brain structure. Startling resonances are being discovered between the fields of brain research and depth psychology. In his book, Archetypes: A Natural History of the Self, the psychologist Anthony Stevens has extended the exploration of areas of the brain that may be the loci of archetypal forms. He tries to explain Jung's theory of personality types in terms of brain structures. Jung's intuitive types, he speculates, might be using predominantly their right brains, and those who favor their left brains would correspond to Jung's thinking types. Briefly, the right brain, the right hemisphere of the cerebral cortex, thinks in images and symbols, grasps situations and patterns as wholes, and is the primary center for the generation of dreams, visions, and fantasies. The left brain, the corresponding left hemisphere, thinks sequentially, analyzes situations and patterns logically, and uses language in its cognitive processes. Many locate the ego entirely in the left brain. In contrast, Stevens proposes that while the ego may function most of the time in the left brain, it also draws on the right brain. Consciousness, he says, is a pervasive function of the whole brain, though right and left brain modes of consciousness are quite distinct. The personal unconscious and its various complexes seem to manifest in the right brain. By dreaming, the right brain communicates with the still primarily left brain identified ego. Rather than locating the archetypes in the right brain, Stevens proposes that they arise in deeper, older layers of the brain, layers that, according to brain researcher Paul MacLean, have remained largely unchanged for millions of years of animal evolution. The dihemispheric cerebral cortex we think of as the human brain is only the most recently evolved element of three distinct neurological regions. Before it, in ascending order of antiquity, come the neocortex, or neo-mammalian brain, apparently responsible for cognition and sophisticated perception, the midbrain, or paleo-mammalian brain, limbic system, which seems to generate the basic emotions of fear and anger, affiliation, and maternity, as well as species-characteristic individual and social behaviors. And the upward growth of the spinal cord, the reptilian brain, or R complex, responsible for basic life activities. Also probably the seat of our most basic instincts and our routine-driven behavior patterns. These three brains within a brain function relatively autonomously. Our process of psychological integration is, in part, an attempt to unify and synchronize these three regions of the brain. If archetypes arise, as Jung believed, at a fundamentally instinctual level, then it could be that they originate in our most primitive region, the reptilian brain. Elaborated as they pass upward through the paleomammalian and neo-mammalian brains, the imagistic, intuitive structures of the archetypes would rise primarily into our right brains. But since our ego's experience of the archetypes will also be mediated via the left brain, they will also be influenced by the linguistic and logical modes of thinking centered there. Archetypes hold a sense of otherness, perhaps because they originate in levels of the brain so much deeper than the source of ego consciousness, and then must be translated into terms that make sense to the left brain. Archetypes in their fullness involve both left and right brain functions. This is clearly the case with the four foundational archetypes of the mature masculine, which we are outlining in this series. Certainly, the rational, strategic, and emotionally detached modes of the magician and the warrior are characteristic of left brain processes, although they seem to draw secondarily on right brain functions. And the visually oriented, aesthetic, intuitive modes of the lover are characteristic of right brain functions, although the lover seems to draw on left brain processes. We attempt a more thorough discussion of the origin of the four archetypes of mature masculinity in the brain's limbic system, the paleomammalian brain, in Appendix B. This field of inquiry is wide open to exciting future research. Convergence of the mature masculine archetypes. Depth psychologists often merge the mature masculine archetypes, because only the most perfectly realized ego apprehends an archetype's full expression. For most of us, they retain a degree of mystery. The very images and symbols archetypes use to communicate to us refer beyond themselves to other images and symbols in an almost infinitely complex way. For example, the phallus, the cross, the tree, the axis mundi, the spine, the sacred mountain, and the pyramid can each be read symbolically as aspects of one another. There are dangers, however, involved with over-interpretations. An individual can easily lose himself, as Yeats was warned in the course of his occult researches along the path of the chameleon, a labyrinthine trail of correspondences. Besides this, the four basic archetypes that influence a mature man, the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover, are the fragments of a primevally whole self, and complement each other to such a degree that no one of them receives its fullest expression without incorporating the others. These archetypes have historically merged and diverged again in a bewildering variety of configurations. Rain magicians, for example, give rise to rain kings, who appoint priests to elect warrior kings, who commission other warriors to serve magicians who themselves become kings. A mortal king, to the extent that he fully expresses the archetypal king, is a warrior who enforces order within his kingdom, and who may take military action to extend his kingdom. He is also a sacred king, the high priest magician who mediates between the spiritual dimension and his people. He is also a lover of his people, and in a special sense of his sacred queen, since he cannot rule legitimately or effectively unless their union is fruitful. Despite these uncertain boundaries, it is useful to distinguish masculine archetypes in order to enhance the ego's capacity to access these psychic structures in all their richness and complexity. The alpha male, a primate prefiguration of the sacred king. Chimpanzees are our closest living animal relatives. Their genetic profile is over 98% identical to ours. Primate ethology research suggests close correspondences between their social structures and interpersonal behaviors and ours. It seems likely that similar psychological processes are at work. While, of course, we cannot know fully what other animals feel and think, in many ways, we cannot be sure we know what other humans feel or think. In either case, we make judgments based on observable behaviors. Our great advantage in observing humans obviously is spoken language, but we still have the subjective task of interpreting linguistic signs. Chimpanzees, while they cannot speak, can communicate with us in sign language and through other quasi-verbal methods designed by researchers. In addition, their complex range of body signals bears a striking resemblance to our own body language. It seems reasonably safe to assume that when chimpanzees appear to be fearful, wrathful, submissive, loving, or awed, they are in fact experiencing these emotions. Probably their emotional experience is less self-conscious and complicated than ours, but still it offers clues into primate psychology, including our own. The hierarchical power blocks and coalitions of chimpanzee society center around a dominant adult male ethologists call the alpha male. Successful alpha males are usually mature and physically powerful. They display foresight, courage, and what can only be called character. Alpha males exhibit many behaviors common to the sacred king, the specific archetypally inspired figure we'll be exploring in the pages to come. Alpha males surround themselves with male knights to help support their claim to power in their realms. These males exhibit characteristics of what David Gilmour calls the cult of manhood in human males. Like their human counterparts, chimpanzee males are protectors and providers for the females and the young of their societies. The alpha male is our first look, long before the curtain of human history rises, at the Lord of the Four Quarters, a title ancient Mesopotamian kings used to describe their central position in what was for them a quadrated cosmos. We believe the alpha males among chimpanzees, gorillas, and other primates are working out of archetypal structures similar to those of their human counterparts, albeit on a much more primitive level. They impose order on the frequent chaotic outbreaks in their realms. They settle disputes, and at their best seem to inspire admiration and respect in their subjects. In return, they defend their subjects with great ferocity, and, at times, pay for their efforts with their lives. Decisions, over when to move the tribe to different feeding grounds, for example, seem largely to be theirs. Alpha males enjoy the trappings of authority and wealth, often in terms of desirable females, for example, but often behave generously, even altruistically. We can see in the alpha male the primordial energic structures of the masculine self. Human males experience this self in a significantly more elaborate form. In one sense, the gap between the alpha male and the sacred kings of human history is an enormous one, millions of years long. In another sense, however, the gap is incremental. If Stevens and others are right in their analysis of human brain structure, there is an alpha male within us. We offer this book and the series as a whole to the man who is looking for an operator's manual to the psyche, and to the woman who wants a guide to the hard wiring of men, and to her own inner masculine as well. Just as no jet pilot would try to fly a 747 without knowing its capabilities and instruments inside and out, the only way to fly successfully an immensely complicated male psyche is to know it inside and out with a clear understanding of how to access its archetypal energy systems. The mindful use of this energy will bring a man safely into his mature manhood.